Okay. Hey, what's up? Can everyone hear me? Okay, cool. Welcome to Case Studies in Android Design. So the point of this presentation is really just to kind of share some experiences of user experience stuff and projects that I've been working on. Just to get an idea before we start, could you raise your hand if you're a developer primarily? Okay, cool. So that is like most of the room, and that includes me, and that's really who this talk is aimed at. One second, sorry. Okay, so my name is Jamie McDonald. So I'm an Android engineer, and writing code is a really big part of what I do. But I'm also really interested in user experience. And I think that this is especially important in mobile when we tend to be building these very personal experiences that live in your pocket. But more generally, I think that teams where the developers and everyone is really understanding of their users and your users' needs tend to make better decisions and build better products. So a bit of my background, I started out in Novoda, which is a company in London and Berlin that build all sorts of apps for all sorts of different clients. And then I spent a while at the Guardian newspaper, and right now I work on the mobile team at Soundcloud. So this isn't a Soundcloud talk, but I will mention a couple of little things about ways we do things. And these are a few of the apps that I've worked on over the last couple of years. So there's a lot of different types of projects, client work, core products, and pet projects that I've just built for myself. I've actually been lucky enough to work on 5 different projects that have been featured on Google Play. Yeah. Okay, sure. In the talk today, I'm not going to show any code or talk about code. I'm not really going to talk about visual design either because I don't really have very much experience with it. But I'll talk about user experience. And user experience is really quite a broad thing. This is something that encompasses the goals and motivations and context of your users. It's about much more than just interface design. And for me, it's really about sort of focusing on the user throughout the whole development of a piece of software. So I'm going to start by telling a story about a pet project of mine, and then later on I'll talk about some more kind of like real-world, bigger projects that involve teams. So the project I'm going to talk about first is called Sudoku. It's a Sudoku game. And at a previous DroidCon, I was kind of joking with a former colleague that people don't really like use any of the techniques that we present on, and people only use their apps to like to play Sudoku games, which is probably not true. But I kind of got thinking about this, and I was on a really boring train journey at one point and started sketching out what it would look like to apply the Holo design language to this domain. And this was released, first version, just over a year ago now. So there were a lot of Sudoku games out there. It was a really saturated section of the market, and a lot of them were like really dated, and a lot of them felt kind of like clunky or like too complicated, but there were also ones that had like tens of like millions of users. Not this one. This is definitely the weirdest one that I came across. So there's like a cow eating some hay on this floating platform that's covered in flowers, and it's got like almost nothing to do with Sudoku. So I was really looking for something that kind of felt at home on my device, and that didn't exist, so I decided to build it. And I think this is really more how people think about Sudoku. It's this newspaper puzzle. And it's really simple on paper, so I wanted to try and preserve that simplicity and only add the kind of extra convenience where it made sense with features like undo and highlighting and some bookmarking stuff. And this is what I came up with. So this is one of the first versions, and this is kind of like a simpler, like cleaner, I think more minimal version of what was already out there. It has pretty much the same functionality as a lot of the other games, but it just kind of tried to differentiate based on design. And it turns out that building something simple is like really, really hard because you need to figure out what you can leave out, what not to include. And to do that, you really need to understand who your user are, or you need to decide who you're targeting in terms of users. So for this, I was pretty happy to build something for casual users. A lot of the other games out there already catered for these like power users, so I could really like focus on sane defaults rather than complex settings and build something very minimal. And even now, like when I'm still working on this project, every release I can review the features that are in the app and decide if there's anything that isn't performing well, if there's anything that I can remove. And this is all just part of an effort to get to the stage where the application is really simple, and then maintain that even though like the requirements are changing or users are demanding different things. But maybe the best thing about this app for users is that it has no ads. So when you're trying to concentrate on a puzzle game, having an ad on the screen is like really distracting and really frustrating. So I think ads can also really cheapen an experience if they're done badly. One of the things that we did at The Guardian was that we added an in-app subscriptions product. And I remember working on this, and the first time that I turned off our banner ads at the bottom of the screen, it just felt like instantly higher quality, and everything else was exactly the same. But just losing the ads made it feel like a much more polished app. So the Sudoku game does have some like in-app payment options, but again, I was kind of thinking about this from a user perspective, and I wanted to avoid these like icky business models where you're like paying for game progress, because I think in the end those are not good for users either. And when I was trying to like drive installs to this application earlier on, when I had no users, I was looking at ways that I could maybe encourage users to rate the app. And it turns out that a lot of the ways that people do this right now are like super clunky. It's like a modal dialogue that comes up and interrupts you and says like, rate my app. And this is a terrible experience at like the time you're asking the user to do something nice for you. So I came up with this like one-shot banners pattern, which is like something that's more easy to ignore. It's not blocking, so you don't have to interact with it, and you can make it go away if you don't want to rate the app. So yeah, I think these sorts of like full screen like blocking dialogues are just like, if you're doing that, then maybe consider trying to do something else. And having like good design or focusing on good design is also like a really good way to get noticed by Google. And getting like noticed in the Google Play Store is probably the most important way to get installs, at least early on. So the game did get featured about 4 months after it was launched. And as I said before, like there are so many other apps that have this exact same functionality. So I guess the conclusion is that it must have been because of the design. And you can tell where on the graph the app got featured, right? So it was something like 30 installs per day, and then it went to like 100,000 for a few days. And even now there's this like sustained like lasting impact where I now get thousands of installs in this app every day just because it was featured at one point in the past. And yeah, this is probably a bit out of date. I think it's something like 1.7 million right now. And it's been pretty well received as well. I think users like a lot of the aspects of the design, and it was slightly higher before Google launched this like Google Play Quick Ratings widget. It was at like 4.5, but yeah, it's still pretty good. I'm happy. But the user experience doesn't end with the app, and it doesn't really end with the Play Store either. So you also need to like think about web presence and like how you interact with your users through like email or forums or any of these sorts of things. I've been trying to kind of continuously improve the app. So the first version was I was just like really focused on shipping something. I wanted to get it out there. And I was much more concerned with like the functionality I was producing than polish. And I think like now it's much more towards polish, and this is kind of like a trade-off and a balance that you have to make, and it's good to kind of be aware of where you are on that and where you want to be. And this is one of the screens that wasn't really designed first time round. It's the scoreboard. It's kind of like clunky and texty and like awkward, and it's really hard to get any information out of it. So I really took a step back and thought, like, what are the user's goals when they arrive on this screen, and redesigned it based on making like the number of completed games much more visual, and doing kind of a graph of the different levels that they'd played so that there was a quick summary. And I'll talk quickly about some of the sort of characteristics that guided the evolution of this app. So all of the improvements I made, I tried to like plan and measure these against user feedback so that I could actually validate what I was building. And as the user base grew, being stable was like much more important. So I paid more attention to crash reporting. I really started to get a lot of value out of the tests that I'd written because I could like confidently release new versions to fix issues. And I think the worst thing that could happen with like tens of thousands of users per day is like some state loss bug where everyone has to like start again from the first puzzle. And the very first version started by just like scaling some dimensions and a few font sizes for different screen sizes. And every release I've kind of gone back and tried to make some improvement in terms of like responsive design. And I think now it's at a place where it actually feels pretty good on a tablet. And I've also tried to keep up with these kind of emerging patterns. So it uses swipe to dismiss and the undo bar and these sorts of things. Also some newer libraries like Google Play Games, which it uses for like achievements and cloud save. And I guess I use it a bit as a testing ground for new libraries that I want to try out. And as you can see in the manifest, it's min SDK 14, which is great because it means like I have very limited time to work on this project, and I can spend more of that time fixing issues or writing new features than like having to waste time in compatibility. So this is one of a kind of category of apps that just does one thing and focuses on doing that one thing really well. And it turns out that there's a really big advantage to a small feature set. There's a lot of research that shows that most users will find the core functionality of an app and they'll stick to it. They very, very rarely explore to find the more advanced features. And there's a lot of apps out there that do this really well. So here are a couple of more examples. Timer by Apollo is just this really simple app, but it set this like huge design trend with the circular time picker. And Hotel Tonight is just amazing in its simplicity. You don't have to do anything. You just open the app, and then based on your location, it gives you all of these really nicely chunked results. It's like super simple. And not every app can do this. So if you're building like a platform, for example, it's very hard to do just one thing. But there's a lot of opportunities to make these like kind of simple, single-use apps that can just kind of corner one section of the market. And when I started this app with no users, I was kind of thinking about like how do I actually measure the success of this design? Like I don't have anything to measure against. I've got no data, so I was thinking about like what were the goals of this application. So I guess you guys are probably familiar with this. This is from the Android design principles in the design guide. And like these are great for the platform, but I think it's also like really valuable to like figure out what your own individual goals are. So back when I was working at Novoda, we had a lot of clients who had already released an iPhone app. And we could have like done the bare minimum and just done like a port. But we were really much more focused on trying to do something that felt kind of right on Android and that pushed the boundaries a bit. Like so on Songkick, for example, we created this sort of live dashboard thing to kind of evolve on an existing pattern. Yeah, so at this point we were saying that we were not just going to port iPhone apps, we were building unique experiences for Android, and that was kind of the motto. And for this game, I decided that it was a simple, beautiful Sudoku for Android. So it's for casual users, so it can be simple. It's got clean design, so hopefully it's beautiful. And it uses a hollow design language and fits in with the Android ecosystem through things like the Google Play Store purchasing. And so I mentioned like beauty on the last slide. And it turns out that there's this really interesting cognitive bias called the aesthetic usability effect, where we're actually willing to overlook more kind of functional problems with an experience if it's beautiful. So visual design is actually like hugely important because this means that users will have a better overall perception of your app, and they will also be more likely to kind of forgive your other mistakes. I think like Yahoo Weather is a really great example of this. It doesn't quite fit on Android, right? But it's a really beautiful app, so everyone loves it. So now I'm going to like shift the perspective a little bit and start talking about a different kind of project, like where there's like a team involved and some kind of like process. So in Novoda, we had like a lot of different clients with a lot of different designers. We were working in a lot of different processes that met their needs. And I think the thing that I got out of this is like the process is the hardest thing to get right, because if you have enough iteration, enough time, all of these other issues kind of like go away. But if you've got a bad process, that tends to get worse rather than better. And this kind of leads me to believe that like good design grows out of good communication between designers, developers, and the users of the app. I think it's perfectly possible to have like a situation where you have some great designers and some great developers, but they produce something that sucks because they didn't understand their users or because they didn't communicate well. And I've also like worked on projects with like these huge design specs. So you have this design in a document which is considered to be completed. And the designer's signed off on it, so the design is done, right? And then we can go and develop the app from that spec. And then once the development is done, we'll like hand that over to QA, and the QA guys will like test it, and then that's the end, right? It doesn't really work in reality. Like, this is fantasy. This leads to developers being blocked. There's normally problems in a design spec, so you end up having like issues, limitations, suggestions of ways that things could be done better, but no method to like communicate this or to iterate on the design. And these kind of specs also lead to this really early focus on visual design, which is the easiest thing to change later. So app design is nonlinear. And the best way to do it right is to kind of iterate together on things like information architecture, user flows, and like early designs. So actually one of the things that we do at Soundcloud is that our designer posts like work in progress versions of designs into our GitHub issues so that we can comment on these and start like thinking about like how we would implement them. But maybe there is a role for the spec. So there are some cases, I think, where you're trying to define some like format or some pattern. But in general, like this shouldn't really be the design deliverable. That should, I think, be the app running on a device at the end of the day. And here are like a few examples of wireframes that we used in Novoda. These actually worked extremely well because they weren't about defining an app. They were a tool for exploration of ideas, and a lot of the time the final product evolved to look not that much like the initial wireframes, but that was okay because these helped us to make better decisions and to make a better product. And if you're interested in like reading a bit more about this kind of like problems with the distance between design and development teams, there's this really great article called Mind the Gap. So if you go to this website, it's just full of these like really concise and thoughtful articles on UI engineering. I'd really highly recommend it. So I also talked about getting to like know your users, and I think the best way to get close to your users is to figure out what they're actually doing. So there are a lot of different channels for discovering this, but maybe the main one is analytics. So this is a great way to find unused features, to find like suboptimal user flows. Like we shouldn't be making product decisions based on gut feelings because data is always more reliable than gut feelings. And there have been like there's a case at The Guardian where we introduced this new sort of onboarding experience where there was a tutorial and it told you a bunch of stuff about like the different features you could use in the app. And it was like this 5-page thing that you would swipe through. And we thought like, yeah, the really engaged users will get more value out of the app after going through this flow. But it turns out like 95% of people just clicked exit on the first page because they wanted to read the news. They didn't want to like read about your app. So like this worked like really badly, and we saw this in the analytics, and we removed it the next release, and we did the right thing. And there's lots of other feedback loops that you can take advantage of. So like email is a good one for like really detailed bug reports, and also for kind of reaching out to your most engaged users. And then there's like Google Plus, which is like a social network that only has Android developers on it. It's amazing. So you can like post ideas and like post early versions of designs for feedback from your peers. It's a really good resource. But in the end, I think user testing is the best way to fail fast at UX. And even if you don't have access to a usability lab, you can like get some like relatives or someone in a coffee shop to like try out a prototype and observe what they're actually doing with it. And Google Play reviews, they can be kind of useful. I know like some people will say that they would never read them, but you can actually spot some like pretty interesting patterns in the types of things that people like often bring up. Like there's a lot of people having a certain issue. It's pretty normally manifests itself in the Google Play reviews. So at The Guardian, I like had this script set up that would email all of the new reviews to everyone on the team every morning. Which is probably extremely annoying, but this was kind of an effort to get people to like think more about like what our users were actually experiencing. And polish is just about going like a bit further, a bit beyond like what's expected, and it's something that you really have to make time for and balance with feature delivery, or it's something that will never get done. And at SoundCloud, one thing that we started doing is treating UX debt in a similar way to that we treat tech debt. So we've kind of categorized this, and like we can plan to pay it off now. And if I look back at like some projects that I've worked on, like the Songkick app was like way over a year ago, maybe almost 2 years ago now. And the things that I'm like most proud of in this application are like will probably seem totally insignificant. It's like this branded loading spinner and the Android Beam concert sharing that we hacked together in one afternoon, and these like textured backgrounds. And they're all like tiny details, but they really add up to make like a much more polished experience. And this is the Easter egg in the Sudoku game. So there's like this hidden heart-shaped puzzle. It's like completely pointless. There's no purpose. It was just a bit of fun. But the people who discover this are actually like really excited by it because it kind of shows that like there's a human making this app. It's not some machine. It's just like shows that you care. And Gigby is one of these apps that I think was way ahead of its time in terms of design detail and polish. But it's kind of like not that surprising if you know the guys behind this. It's a really great designer and developer who are both really really passionate about what they produce. And this is just like a really nice way of handling a common problem. So they have this illustration at the top of the screen for context. They have the explanation of why the view is empty. And then they have a button at the bottom that will fix this problem, essentially. And I just thought this was kind of like a super neat like solution to like a problem that every app has and that a lot of people do like quite badly. And when we talk about Android design, there's this thing that always comes up, which is this supposed tension between like the hollow design guidelines and your brand. And if you have a brand, it's a pretty good thing to utilize because it inspires like trust and loyalty. But it doesn't actually have to be a trade-off a lot of the time. I think there are just some like misconceptions in the way that we think about blending brand with the Android platform. So like the first thing is that navigation isn't a brand. It's like a super weird place to try and put brand because users have such strong expectations about how navigation will behave, and if you interfere with that, then a user is going to just be frustrated. And I think there's some other like places that this apply, like using like icons from other platforms or using kind of these like glossy buttons that don't quite feel right. These are all like these aren't part of your brand. You can quite easily like adapt to like maintain your brand, but also do things that feel right on Android. And on the other hand, like Hollow is not like just about the Roboto fonts or about this like blue highlight. This is really a design language more than it is a default theme. So there are plenty of other places that you can represent your brand really well, using like colors, fonts, graphics, like the tone of your text even, are all like great opportunities. And like this sort of branding is like actually really simple now because we have great tools like the Action Bar style generator and Hollow Colors. These will generate pretty much all of the line patches for you. And one last thing on brand is that if you have a brand, you should try and represent it well, because having a really crappy mobile experience is just like not a good representation of your brand. It seems like you don't care. So in terms of user experience, like, what are the things that the people actually really care about? So this definitely depends quite a lot on context, but I'm going to try and like sum this up in like a few categories. So there are things that we get for free for just designing for the Android platform. So these are consistency, familiarity, and learnability. So these limit confusion, and they limit the amount of learning that a user has to do just to use your application. And I don't think there's really any like downside to making your app consistent with other apps on the platform. And this is probably a less conscious concern, but having things like small touch targets, like bad feedback states, there are just like causes of like annoyance and error. And they're really like super cheap to like find and fix, because all you need to do is apply some like simple heuristics to your application. And developers can do a lot of things that users think are magic. So this could be something as simple as like auto-completing an email address so that you don't have to do any awkward typing. Or it could be like more complicated, like figuring out what bands someone likes from the music that's on their phone. Or maybe just like going a bit beyond what's in the design guide and making some sort of unique experience. So yeah, these are just like ways to delight and surprise users. And control, like users like to have control of their devices, and they should. So they really value like predictable behavior. And I think when your app behaves unpredictably, this is like a real cause of like confusion. So we ran a study, a usability study at The Guardian, where we were trying out some like new personalization prototype that would take sections away if you didn't read them very often. And people weren't actually reading these sections, but when we took them away, they felt this real like loss aversion, because they weren't really like in control of the content that was showing anymore, and they hated it. Yeah, so we didn't implement that, of course. And I think it's really easy to imagine when we're spending all day developing these apps that all of our users are like super engaged and they're spending as much time on it as we are. But in reality, like our apps make up like a tiny proportion of like an overall routine. And there are always like alternatives to your apps. So thinking about like what the user like actually feels, like if they did they like accomplish their goal, or did they get lost and then become confused and then leave the app feeling stupid, then they're probably not going to come back. And these are some of the reasons I think like focusing on user experience is like super important. So that's all. Any questions? Yeah.
Hi. You mentioned that you took out one of the pages based on the analytics information. How do you get feedback if the decision you make removing that page or removing that activity is a valid choice? Because do you look at some percentage of use and say, well, is it less than 10% we're not using the page anymore?
Yeah, so in this case, essentially everyone who was seeing this screen was just skipping past it. So it was more of like a barrier to entry to the app than actually providing any value. So we still wanted a way to like diversify the like different features that the users would use in the app, but we just thought we would try this thing and look at the data and see what it told us. And it was really telling us that this was the wrong way to go about it, because we were expecting like maybe 30 or 40% of people to be engaged with this flow, and it was almost no one. So we took it out and tried something else instead. But I guess like the long-term like correct thing to do in this case would be to try and like A/B test something and actually see which methods are actually resulting in more adoption. But this is more like costly and more setup.
Hello. Do you have any experience with Google Plus alpha and beta communities?
Yeah, I have a beta community for my Sudoku game that has 5 members. But that's all. Like, I think it's a really great thing. It's something I'd like to use more in the future. But okay, cool. Thanks very much.